Welcome, everyone. Thank you, as always, to Shayna and Eva for their extraordinary work in making this possible. Our thanks to Verej Karti Shemtov, the faculty director of the Taube Center for Jewish Studies, for her vision and her excitement about this idea, and to the editorial staff and contributors of the Dibur Literary Journal for making this important dream a reality through their writing and incredibly hard work. Today's event is a very exciting development in a scholarly field that dates, to a certain degree, back to Lynn White Jr.'s famous or infamous indictment of religion as part of what he called the historical roots of our climate crisis. Lynn White Jr. condemned the linear teleological conceptions of time found in, quote, Judeo-Christian sources, also the anthropocentric creation narratives, and hence the anthropocentric worldviews, as well as a generalized indifference to nature and a subservience to a detached and transcendent God. White's argument, spelled out in that 1967 article, left religious thinkers and scholars of religion in all of its many and various forms largely on the defensive. Some have sought to discredit the science of climate change or to insulate the study of religion against any kind of scientific incursions. Others sought to reinterpret ancient traditions in ways that parallel contemporary environmental thought in an attempt to demonstrate ecological principles that were always there at the heart of their religious texts or their faith. This search for connections or analogies yields little more than forced results. It's kind of like saying, I know we need stewardship, so how am I going to say that in Jewish? But to address the climate crisis, one of the great moral and existential questions of our own age, we need to go beyond these kinds of surface-level analyses and readings. We need to explore the sources of literature and culture with an eye to new ways of thinking that overturn assumptions about our relationship to the world around us. And it is with that hope in mind that I'm so honored to welcome you to this symposium on Jewish ecologies. With that, I'll hand it over to Chen.
So thank you, Ariel. And I'll say that I'm really excited to be here to celebrate the launch of this special double issue of Dibur dedicated to Jewish ecologies. In this issue, we set out to explore what Jewish literature, both ancient and modern, can offer in thinking about ecology, environmental crisis, and the more than human world. Moving beyond anthropocentric readings, the issue brings together texts and perspectives that challenge familiar boundaries and open space for new ethical and imaginative possibilities. It invites readers to consider how Jewish writing engages with ecological issues and with ecological questions, and seeks to suggest paths forward for the study of Jewish literatures in the Anthropocene. So I hope you will all check out the issue and enjoy reading it. And to begin our program, I'll be giving the first talk based on my own contribution to the issue. So in his 2018 poem, Who Am I?, Israeli eco-poet Adi Wolfson asks, who am I to speak on behalf of the trees and for the stones, to be a mouth for the wind and water, to become a voice crying in the wilderness for the winged creatures? The speaker acknowledges the limits of human understanding and perception, highlighting that all human knowledge is shaped by human experience. And yet the poem ends with who? I, asserting the poet's responsibility to speak for the non-human and bring their perspective into the very human literary discourse. This awareness of the fact that our knowledge of the world is inevitably human-centered, along with the blurring of the boundaries between the human and non-human, and an urgent sense of responsibility to communicate an altered sense of our reality to readers, are all characteristics of what I call the ecological turn in modern Hebrew literature, a phenomenon that reflects global literary trends while also emerging from Hebrew literature's unique sociocultural and physical context. Eco-critics have proposed various terms to define literature where the environment occupies a central role. So famously, Lawrence Buell described an environmental text as one where, the non-human environment is more than just a backdrop. It challenges human-centered approaches and proposes new ethics. Jim Dwyer defined ecofiction as works exploring environmental issues and humanity's relationship with nature, highlighting ecology's core principle, the interconnectedness of all organisms. Though ecofiction has historical roots, its prominence has recently grown alongside rising ecological awareness. So, what about Hebrew literature? Hebrew literature has traditionally centered on the human sphere, treating nature either as a backdrop or a symbolic tool rooted in anthropocentric concerns. Egil Schwartz highlights how Hebrew literature has historically linked landscape with its human engineering, shaping the relationship between Jews and the land. Early Israeli literature, influenced by Zionist ideology, depicted nature as an asset to be conquered and cultivated, epitomized by the ethos of making the desert bloom, להפריח את השממה. In recent years, however, Hebrew literature has begun to reimagine its relationship with nature, driven by ecological concerns such as desertification, drought, and the climate crisis. This ecological turn, emerging over the past 2 decades, spans genres including eco-poetics, nature writing, and climate fiction. My research into this turn delves into works of fiction, nonfiction, poetry, and children's literature by various authors as I examine the forms and themes by which they explore the more than human world. While Hebrew ecofiction is still gaining scholarly attention, these works mark a significant shift in how contemporary Hebrew literature engages with space, the environment, interspecies relationships, and possible climate futures. So in the short time I have today, I'll focus on one of the most distinctive voices of this ecological turn, Tamar Weisgebay, who recently received the prestigious Brenner Prize for her ecofiction. Today we'll discuss one of her short stories called The Place, which is also included in our issue for the first time in English translation, and which I see as a key story to demonstrate how the literature of the ecological turn can offer new ways of viewing the contested Israeli-Palestinian space. So the story's title, The Place, is drawn from its epigraph, "The place will comfort you," a traditional Jewish expression of condolence where hamakom typically refers to God. The story reinterprets this phrase, stripping the concept of place from its human-centered meanings and exploring it as a literal physical space. Can comfort be found in the materiality of the place itself? The place at the center of this story is the Temple Mount, both a site of solace and one of the most contested locations at the heart of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. One of the story's key innovations is its attempt to move beyond an anthropocentric perspective, offering a broader, more than human perspective on this fraught site. The story's protagonists are a Palestinian boy, a Jewish woman, and a vixen. Alongside these human and non-human figures, the mountain itself becomes a character, portrayed in its raw materiality, free of human-imposed symbolism. The narrative begins from a perspective distant from the human. As the earth turned its back to the sun, the vixen felt something changing inside her and began seeking a place for it. This opening not only centers on the vixen's viewpoint, telling the story of the Temple Mount through the perspective of a non-human creature, but it begins from a perspective even broader and more remote from the human, the movement of the earth itself. Rather than framing dusk through an anthropocentric gaze, the story adopts a broader, non-human perspective, reminding us from its very outset that the basic phenomena we interpret through our human-centered view, what we might call nightfall, are in fact much broader and more expansive, the Earth's rotation on its axis. In doing so, the story immediately displaces us from the conventional human-centered understanding of this place, situated at the heart of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, offering instead a perspective that defamiliarizes both the place and our habitual ways of seeing. The narrative then shifts to the vixen's perspective as she prepares for the change she senses inside her and seeks a den for her soon-to-be-born pups. The depiction of the vixen is innovative not only for presenting the Temple Mount from a non-human perspective, but also for the way it addresses the challenge of writing animal consciousness. So, literature has historically anthropomorphized animals or portrayed them as symbols for human experience. Echoing philosopher Thomas Nagel in his essay, What Is It Like to Be a Bat?, we can say that this stems in part from the inaccessibility of animal consciousness to human understanding. Some more recent writing, however, deals with this challenge, engaging in what eco-critic Timothy Clark terms animal hermeneutics, reshaping human language to convey the life world of another species, striving to bridge the species barrier while resisting anthropomorphism. This story demonstrates a commitment to ethically portraying the vixen without anthropomorphizing or erasing her otherness. The language remains careful and external, focusing on the vixen's actions to signify her emotions. This respectful portrayal fosters empathy while still preserving the distance between the human and non-human, embodying a sensitivity reminiscent of Levinas's ethical approach to otherness, extended here to the non-human other. John Simons suggests that literary texts focalized through a non-human perspective offer, and I quote, a transgressive route not only across species boundaries, but also between the closed formal universe of the linguistic artifact and into the material world in which it exists. This is evident in the story not only through the representation of the vixen, but also in the portrayal of the mountain. Throughout the fragment centered on the characters, descriptions of the place are interwoven, but not as the Temple Mount, but as a mountain in its physical essence. A geological formation altered by human action to the point that its natural form is almost invisible. And I quote from the story, "For 2,000 years now, the mountain itself had remained hidden, out of sight, imprisoned almost entirely by retaining walls on every side, the peak flattened and paved, made sacred." By focusing on the mountain's geological presence rather than its human-imposed meanings, the narrative restores its essence as a physical entity. This shift defamiliarizes this space, opening new ways to perceive it, not through anthropocentric interpretations, but as a material reality, encouraging readers to view both the place and the conflict it represents with fresh eyes. The Palestinian boy's narrative reveals how intimately his life is tied to the mountain. He recalls walking there with his grandfather, who fed the local cats there and quoted scriptures, and family picnics under the trees rooted in the mountain's hidden soil. Now he plans to stay there overnight, avoiding home as he anticipates possible news of his father's passing. Similarly, the Jewish woman's narrative reflects her spiritual connection to the mountain. She comes there to pray, distraught after her husband's request for a divorce. Yet, as she gazes upon the mountain, its symbolic meaning fades, leaving only its raw physicality. By highlighting the unmediated physical connection to the mountain and stripping away human-imposed meanings, the story insists on the mountain's pure mountainness, inviting readers to see it unbound by religious or ideological convictions. It reframes the mountain as an ecological niche where the various human and non-human protagonists live in a shared environment. The conflict over this place, while not explicitly addressed, emerges as yet another struggle in nature over territory and resources. Ecologist Aldo Leopold has called for humans to think like a mountain, see the land as an integrated whole replete with hidden webs of interdependent relationships. The story's portrayal of the Temple Mount as a physical mountain stripped of symbolic meanings embodies this sensibility. By exploring the connections of its protagonists, a vixen, a Muslim boy, and a Jewish woman, to the mountain, the narrative exemplifies Leopold's call to view the land through a broader ecological lens, even in a place as symbolically charged as the Temple Mount. Leopold ties this sensitivity to the environment to his concept of land ethics. And I quote, "All ethics so far evolved rest upon a single premise, that the individual is a member of a community of interdependent parts. His instincts prompt him to compete for his place in that community, but his ethics prompt him also to cooperate, perhaps in order that there may be a place to compete for. The land ethic simply enlarges the boundaries of the community to include soils, waters, plants, and animals, or collectively, the land. It changes the role of Homo sapiens from conqueror of the land community to plain member and citizen of it. It implies respect for his fellow members and also respect for the community as such. The story seeks to achieve such land ethics by portraying the mountain and the intricate connections among those whose lives are intertwined with it. It challenges human-centered perceptions, broadening our perspective beyond the political view of Israelis and Palestinians competing over the land as a physical and symbolic resource. Instead, it incorporates non-human actors and a non-anthropocentric understanding of place. This expanded land ethic does not shy away from the political, but rather reframes and complicates it, aligning with Leopold's vision of land ethics as a fuller awareness of place and the complex networks of human and non-human entanglements within it. In the narrative, the significance of place and time transcends human perception. The boy, gazing at the olive trees, acknowledges the deep time of the trees that extends far beyond human temporality. He recalls a quote from the Muslim scriptures shared by his grandfather about the finiteness of human life, contrasting human time with the enduring lifespan of the trees. This meditation on time connects the boy's perspective to that of the Jewish woman, emphasizing their shared mortality and fleeting human time, which stands in contrast to the broader, non-human scale of time. The concept of deep time reemerges when the boy lies down on the ground. Beneath his head lies a fossilized shell from the ancient Tethys Sea, introducing deep geological time, distinct from human temporality. In that moment, he imagines riding the sea's waves, bridging the vast temporal divide. The narrative thus expands beyond anthropocentric perceptions of time and place, tracing the long process from the Tethys Sea to the present. And I quote, "The sea had risen and washed over the land, and after many days it receded. Then it flooded again and withdrew once more until it became shallow. Hundreds of thousands of years passed, and it became a swamp. The sea creatures died, their remains sinking to the depths. Time passed, and the water continued to evaporate. The skeletal sediment crystallized into limestone, with fossils of snails and seashells embedded here and there. Life turned into stone. That was how the mountain had been formed. And the mountain stood thus, dry, exposed to sunlight. Terrestrial life developed on it, plants, reptiles, insects, mammals, until once again it was covered and disappeared. Someone had chosen it, this very mountain, out of all the similar mountains around it, to be encircled by stone walls, buried in darkness, sealed." This passage offers a biography of the mountain, tracing its formation after the sea's retreat and its later burial under human construction, which conceals its essence as a mountain. By invoking deep time, the narrative frames the Temple Mount's religious significance as a fleeting moment within its vast geological history. This shift in perspective invites a radically different understanding of a place so central to human history, opening its story to a broader, non-human temporality. Towards the end of the story, the boy, now asleep on the mountain, dreams of deep time, but now he envisions the future of the mountain. And in his dream, many more years passed. Roots of plants probed cracks in the rocks, penetrating them, crumbling them. Lichen and blue-green algae drilled into them. Wind and rain and sun washed over the mountain and the chiseled stones that enclosed it, accelerating the erosion. Years, centuries, and millennia passed, and the mountain gradually crumbled. But next to the mountain and its environs, skeletons, like his grandfather's, went on being buried and disintegrating and turning into rocks, into earth, into a part of this place, which went on morphing into something else, as all things do, always. In this vision, the Temple Mount eventually disintegrates, decomposed by microscopic organisms. While unsettling from a human-centered perspective, this process reflects the natural order from an ecocentric viewpoint. This, perhaps, is the moment alluded to in the story's epigraph, "The place will comfort you." Just as the fossil from the ancient Tethys Sea endures, the boy realizes that bones, like those of his late grandfather, will merge with the rocks, the earth, the place itself. The story reframes the mountain's constant transformation, a source of fear, as a certainty, perhaps the only certainty one can truly rely on. This connects to the Jewish woman's experience. A human being like herself, bound in time and place, cannot see the tremendous movement, but on and on it goes. And on through time, the forms disintegrate and change. Things in any case have already happened and continue to happen, slowly, in the soft, perpetual change, never stopping. The notions of movement, dissolution, and transformation, often resisted from a human perspective, are presented here as soft and comforting. Fittingly, this moment of tenderness is followed by the vixen giving birth to her pups, symbolizing renewal. The motion introduced at the story's outset, the Earth's rotation, becomes a central motive, culminating in the story's conclusion with its theme of inevitable change. The Temple Mount, typically seen as a static, unchanging cultural fixture, is, on the scale of deep geological time, subject to gradual and perpetual transformation. In this inevitability of change lies perhaps the only enduring certainty, and perhaps a source of profound comfort. Thank you.
Wonderful. Now we'll hear from Yotam.
Ilan Mintz's central argument in his introductory study on Hebrew American verse, Sanctuary in the Wilderness, revolves around the Hebrew American writer's profound attachment to the Hebrew language. He attributes the anomalous phenomenon of writing Hebrew literature in the American diaspora to the Hebraists, and I quote, religious and sensual experience of Hebrew. This profound religious libidinal attachment to Hebrew, he asserts, is the secret spring of American Hebraism. He terms this experience and attachment the apotheosis of Hebrew. The desire to write in Hebrew in the diaspora, combined with a recognition of its cultural and traditional importance for the global Jewish community, are crucial elements. However, in my paper, I argue that this sensual and religious desire cannot be fully understood without considering its ties to American culture, environment, and the Hebraist longing for nature. The Hebrew-American poet Avraham Regelson wrote in his essay from 1941, אלוהי הטבע בשירה האמריקאית, God of Nature in American Poetry, that people who are true to their country's constitution, to their land's nature, to the poetic rustle and prophetic warnings which are anointed by the land on its finest, they shall live in it. This text does not refer to the land of Israel or Palestine, as one might assume, but to America and to the American landscape. According to Regelson, not only the national, theological, linguistic, cultural, and poetic aspects are important for an American, but also his engagement with nature, true to their land's nature. In fact, all of these aspects are described as tangled up together. And if, as Lawrence Buell suggests, and I quote, nature has long been reckoned a crucial ingredient of the American national ego, then the American environmental imagination should be recognized as a significant habitat for the emergence of Hebrew-American poetics. In this context, the apotheosis of Hebrew cannot be understood in isolation. Both the American landscapes and American naturism must be taken into account. In my paper, then, I reread Hebrew-American literature written in the first half of the 20th century, focusing on the central role the American environmental imagination played in it. I situate the Hebrew-American writers within ecological literary discourse without necessarily proposing an eco-critical reading. While their work does not engage directly with the real, meaning they cannot be defined as nature poets or environmentalists, Their literary output reveals, as Chris Fitter calls it, a strong nature sensibility and landscape consciousness. Reading the Hebraists through the lens of landscape poetry, I contend that the landscape in their work serves as a cultural and psychological reflection of their minds, but at the same time it also reflects, in Andrew Taylor's words, and I quote, a relation to nature, to a landscape, in which nature and subject are interdependent. The perspective I propose reframes Hebrew American literature within the discourse of Hebrew literary historiography. Rather than interpreting it through the lens and backdrop of Zionist national project or even within a broader framework of Jewish literature, and rather than defining its distance from the canon as one of linguistic, poetic, and historical belatedness as literature that falls behind, like many scholars argued, I suggest we view it as being ahead of its time, both poetically and conceptually, by weaving close ties with the texture of Anglophone culture. Hebrew American literature explored landscapes and humanity's desire for nature in their materiality and outside the national Zionist context of conquering the land, long before these themes became central to Israeli literature and the Hebrew canon. Culturally and geographically, Hebrew American literature largely took root in New England. It is difficult to overlook the influence of what Albena Bakracheva calls the phenomenon of New England on the Hebraists. This cultural and poetic phenomenon, created by Harvard University's intellectuals, absorbing from New England traditions and moral categories, as well as from European Romanticism and intellectual currents from early 19th century Europe, this phenomenon is embodied in the works of significant American nature writers such as Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and other transcendentalists. In my paper, I analyzed 3 Hebrew American texts written by poets from the New England area and shaped by its cultural atmosphere. These texts, Avraham Regelson's essay Eloi HaTeva בשירה האמריקאית, God of Nature in American Poetry from 1941, Shimon Halkin's על חוף Santa Barbara, On the Shore of Santa Barbara from 1946, and Gabriel Pryle's Ode to Maine, Mitziure Maine, Sketches of Maine, also from 1946. These texts hold particular significance as they exemplify the central role of the environmental imagination and landscape poetry in Hebrew American literature. Here, in the short time that I have, I will focus on Halkin's poem On the Shore of Santa Barbara. Shimon Halkin, born in Belarus in 1898, immigrated to America at the age of 15. He attended Morris High School in the Bronx and later studied at City College of New York. After the horrors of World War II, Halkin immigrated permanently to Israel in 1949, where he was appointed as a professor of Hebrew literature at the Hebrew University. He lived in Jerusalem until his death in 1987. The long poem On the Shore of Santa Barbara, standing as one of his most celebrated works and a significant achievement in Hebrew American literature, exemplify the way Halkin's encounter with the American landscape is reflected in his work. The poem captures a profound attitude towards nature, embodied in the speaker's ecstatic and erotic engagement with Santa Barbara's shore. Following Timothy Morton's concept of ambience in understanding the notion of nature in Western thought, I argue that Halkin's poem embodies an erotic ambience towards the landscape, a sexual ecstasy of the surrounding world that poetically renders Santa Barbara's shore as both earthly and divine. Ambience, writes Morton, derives from the Latin ambo, from both sides. It denotes a sense of circumambient or surrounding world. It suggests something material and physical, though somewhat intangible, as if space itself had a material aspect. The dynamics of the two sides Morton describes, the physical and the metaphysical, the real and the abstract, reflects the poem's dialectics of existence, yesh in Hebrew, and nothingness, ein in Hebrew, of land, eretz, and God's presence. I want to share with you a small fragment from the poem through which I will illustrate my argument. I'll read it in Hebrew first and then a literal translation to English. אתה אין עוד שיר אל, את ארץ, לבדך. בלעתיני, עברתיני, ואני נכנעתי. הרייך מתלבנים בחום הצהריים. ימך המתפנק בשקט מפרצייך, שיקרוני בי נסחו שם, עד שכוח אל. בלעתיני ארץ, שיעבדתיני כנרצה, צבאייך בני חלוף, גילך זה בן חלוף, הם המה בי ישורו, ואני נכנעתי. אכן אגבה בהם שיכור ומתעלף, וליבי המום לא יאזין עוד רון אלוה? Now God's song is no more. It is you, land alone. You swallowed me, blinded me, and I surrendered. Your mountains, whitening in the heat of noon, your sea indulging in your silent gulfs, have intoxicated me, poured their fire onto me until God was forgotten. You have swallowed me, land, enslaved me. Your colors are temporary, your age is temporary. They claimed power over me, and I surrendered. Will I perish within them intoxicated and fainted? Will my overwhelming heart hear the song of God no more? The eroticism in the poem in which the speaker metaphorically makes love with Santa Barbara's shore, entwining love, pain, elevation, and agony, is unmistakable. The stanzas above, describing the land's mountains and gulfs in the shape of the female body, intoxicating in their erotic and physical figuration, cannot fully capture its significance, but do show a little of this. This form of ecstatic and divine eroticism directed towards the land, or the sacred as feminine, is often associated in Hebrew literature to God's Shekhinah, the divine presence described in rabbinic literature as God's manifestation in the world, or with the Zionist ideal of the land of Israel. Both Shekhinah and the Hebrew word for land, Eretz or Adama, are grammatically feminine, enabling male writers in these theological and national contexts to portray them as brides to be wooed or lovers to be conquered and claimed. However, Halkin's ecstatic eroticism in this poem is directed neither toward God nor the land of Israel, but rather to the shore of Santa Barbara. The desire for the landscape stands in sharp contrast to the Zionist longing for the land of Israel. Zionist aspirations often involve conquering the national land, metaphorically sowing and seeding the soil to impregnate it, and transforming the wilderness into a flourishing habitat, a vision encapsulated in the well-known Zionist phrase, להפריח את השממה. In Alkin's poem, however, the speaker does not seek to dominate or cultivate the land. He yearns to be enslaved by it, to surrender completely, to be blinded and swallowed by the physical and material world it represents. The Zionist perspective situates men as masters, conquerors. This view is clearly patriarchal and, in ecological terms, anthropocentric, rooted in human exceptionalism, where humans, men specifically, are the central axis around which the world, and women, revolves. In Halkin's poem, however, the speaker takes on the role of a subjected slave, a lover blinded by love who willingly surrenders to be consumed by his beloved. While humans in this scenario are not portrayed as equals with nature, they are also not in a position of dominance. Instead, nature, and not humanity, is placed at the center of existence. Throughout the speaker's ecstatic experience, then, he chooses to be swallowed by the existence of the material reality of the land, Eretz, rather than dissolve into the abstraction of God and nothingness. He wishes, in Halkin's words, to cease to exist in nothingness. Yet God does not entirely vanish. As the speaker asks near the stanza's conclusion, the question of God's song stays present. Will I perish within them, intoxicated and fainted? Will my overwhelming heart hear the song of God no more? This lingering question suggests that the song of God resurfaces after the speaker's submission to the land, albeit as an unresolved presence. This argument is strengthened at the beginning of the poem's third part, when Santa Barbara enters the stage in all of its glory. The holy reappears, not as the Shekhinah, but in the figure of Saint Barbara, the Christian martyr. In this sense, Halkin's poetic persona aligns more with Emerson's poet priest, a free-spirited, spiritual poet who praises God in men, than with the Hebrew prophet Yechezkel, a watchman unto the house of Israel, who prophesied the restoration of the Jewish people to the land of Israel, or with its modern incarnation in Hebrew and Israeli writers. What then are we to do to make of this? Does the speaker position himself as powerless before the materiality of nature, or in the face of an abstract God? And with whom does he make this erotic love? With a metaphysical nothingness or with a physical being? Can the song of God still be heard? Or has it been entirely replaced by this erotic apotheosis of the land? The answer is both, of course. The apotheosis of Hebrew, Lashon HaKodesh, is tangled up with the apotheosis of the land. It is in this erotic ambience towards the landscape that renders Santa Barbara's shore as both earthly and divine. Halkin's erotic ambience is only one example of the Hebraist's poetic desire for nature, of course. And though I don't have enough time to elaborate more, I do want to conclude my presentation with a quote from another prominent Hebrew-American poet, Gabriel Prowl, who well articulated the Hebraist perception of their Americanness, also in its environmental context. This text, I would like to think, can be seen as an open ending. And I will end with this. One who has the pretension to be amongst the country's lovers is in need of taking a deep breath, a breath of joy in its landscapes. Americanness lies in understanding the scents and shades that only this climate can create, acclimatizing in the land's heritage and history, written and oral, to the point of knowing its finest nuances. Thank you.
Okay, I understand now we'll hear a response
Yes.
from Noam.
I based the responses on reading your articles. And these were kind of the things that came to mind. So take that, as an opportunity to, sort of think about like that. Those were kind of the things that stood out for me. So I'd like to start with Chen and the way that you describe the ecological turn in general, but perhaps also in Hebrew literature. This reminds me of the following picture. You can see that like you are here, like there's a galaxy and the earth is tiny. It's like you're here. Or I recently saw this in a movie. It's a move. You see, like it's a kind of a strategy. It's like saying, oh, you're concerned about how to pay your bill, how to pay your phone bill, how to do your job, what's gonna happen to you in the future. But you're just like this tiny speck on a tiny rock in a big galaxy, and who are we and what are we doing here? The same kind of it's the same kind of strategy that comes about when I don't know where I saw it, but there was I saw in some movie or some television, like there's this woman that came and saw a fossil, and all of a sudden she realized all her problems in life are kind of diminished compared to the eons, and you know what I mean. And so this is the move that you're essentially describing, right? The meanings, the human meanings that uh, people ascribe to places are transient. Um, but, and here's what I would like to sort of think about. That perspective is achieved through technology. You're not able to understand the galaxy. You're not able to assess fossils for what they are, and to get that sort of grand scheme of time. This is a fairly new experience within the last 150 years ago. It is deeply implicated in the way that humans understand themselves through that anthropocentric. You see what I mean? Like it's precisely through the development of science, through the development of a greater instrumental capacity to control nature, that you're paradoxically able to achieve a perspective that diminishes your place in the cosmos. And I think that tension is like worth sort of thinking about or contemplating over. That's one thing. And the other thing that sort of came in, and this will also come in Yotam's paper, you present, there's this, the turn, okay? Like the whole idea that we're facing. I'm sorry if I hope I'm not being too critical. I'm just trying to be productive. Yeah, please do. And the whole idea of a turn means like, basically kind of reconfigure, rethink things. And I would like to, suggest that perhaps, and I will address this when refer to what you said. This is with romanticism. With Chen's paper, I think it has something to do with allegory. First of all, I noticed that in the stories that you sort of discussed in your article, you notice that people are not named, animals are not, and so I was wondering what you thought about that sort of unnaming, and I think that it's the removal of names, or the kind of, it's you can read it as like along with Ursula Heise's challenge, sort of distinction between the what you call it, the global and the local, a kind of perspective that would perhaps also encapsulate how the sort of the ecology stands in relation to the Anthropocene, the anthropocentric world, the world of human beings, the historical world. Let's just call it that. It's history, right? Versus maybe something like, I don't know exactly how to call it, natural history. I'm not. I would be a little hesitant. I think natural history is really that place where nature and history come together in this non-relation, right? Like it's like where they don't connect. And I think that's essentially what you're sort of describing. But I don't think that that perspective is achieved through raw materiality. I don't think that what you call raw materiality is really, to me, it's defamiliarization. It's a literary technique. I forgot the name of the Shklovsky. Thank you. Formalism, right? So it's all like implicated in questions of technique, just like the galaxy or the fossil. It's all sort of you never really get out of the anthropocentric perspective, except in one case it's a really beautiful example that it actually comes up in two places in your article. One with the wind, the moaning wind, the morning moaning wind. What is that? That's what I'm talking about. It's something that remains. We don't understand what it is. It's the when you really sort of reach that moment of the turn. The turn is not when you see yourself as a tiny speck in the cosmos. It's the moment that you realize this is beyond you. Your perspective is challenged. You become sort of you become naturalized through the inability to articulate a deeper meaning. And that sensibility is allegorical, because if you think about allegory as like a signifier, right? That's supposed to sign something, right? Signify something, like signify. What remains when you look at, let's say, this is something I said many times. It's like you look at a 17th century allegory, okay, that may have been clear to somebody in the 17th century what that a person with a sword that, I don't know, whatever, it has a specific hat. In the 17th century, everybody knew what it meant. For you, what's left is that signifier. That's really the power of allegory. It's what remains. It's this cipher that refuses meaning. It's like this signifier. You know it means something, but you don't know what it means. And for me, that is and where's that kind of comes into place when this teenager uses the old man and the sea. She literally takes the book and wipes the blood. So she gives up the deeper meaning of the book and uses it as a signifier. And to me, that moment catches, that sort of ecological turn that you're talking about. Another thing that I was puzzled by, that you reject. You're saying that the weather woman is kind of like, she represents like this, and this, I don't have an answer for this. Okay, so I'm just like curious about this. Um, she represents like a perspective that you seem like ethically is like succumbing to nature, and she's kind of like It's not like the old man is the teacher is like the anthropocentric. We got to reject that. The weather woman is uh too much to the other end, right? Like she's submissive to like we're nothing but we're like tiny speck. We don't have any meaning. Our lives are meaningless. So why is the story named after her? And why is that sort of significance? And also, I couldn't help notice that you mentioned that the city will fall from a cliff, and she ends up sharing the same future. That's well, I haven't read the story, so I can't. But it just sort of popped. Those are the basic things, and I don't know how you want me to should I address Yotam's work, or I don't know how you want to lay it.
It's up to you.
Um, I can respond.
Okay.
So thank you for your comments. They're very thought-provoking. I agree with some of them, but not with all of them. So I think, well, I disagree with you about the fact that it's technology that enables this view that sort of, displaces us from our more traditional human-centered views. I think that, first of all, it's a scale, right? But there's a real challenge. In the fact that we are using human language, right? This is what these are the confines of our thinking. It's human language, and then we're writing literature in human language for human readers. So how do you represent something that sort of goes beyond the boundaries of human perception? And we see this challenge, it's not only about scale, right? You have Bohrstein's writing, which sort of tries to play with scale and either makes us see things from the really small perspective of insects or from the very large perspective of in his book Man in Space. But we can also see this in what I was talking about today. For example, how do you represent animal consciousness? How do you respectfully represent the vixen, taking into consideration the fact that most of what you need is not knowable to you, right? We cannot really enter animal consciousness. Um, so it's about how do you deal with this challenge, and one way of seeing it is what you said. We need technology, and it's very ironic that it's the human technology that enables us to see deep deep geological time. But there's also the feminist care tradition in animal ethics that says that what enables us to see things differently is empathy, right? When you look at an animal and you have this sort of interspecies communication that is rooted in attentiveness, this is what actually enables you or some sort of access to the animal's consciousness, right? And if you have the same attentiveness when you are in nature and you look at insects or at trees, then this is what brings you this insight, and you can call it defamiliarization, right? That's one way of seeing it, but it's also a completely altered perspective of the place of humans in the universe and in the more than human world. It sort of decenters our perception. So yes, I mean, it's technology, but it's not only technology. It's about a different way of thinking, and it is a real challenge, not only for literary writers, but for philosophers and for humans in general. How can we transcend the boundaries of human language that sort of affects the way we perceive things around us? That's one point that I wanted to make.
Can I add something just
Yes,
before you move to
of
the next?
course.
I was thinking when we were talking, it's about listening and seeing, right? A lot of this, it's about language, of course, but it's about how you see and how you make language, I don't know, bear this option of, I don't know, seeing and listening. And I was reminded when you were talking in the criticism, I was reminded by Ranana Kedar talk in the previous workshop, and she was trying to talk about a different way of listening, and she uses technology, of course, but it's all about this. I mean, I don't agree with what she said, although I really love the effort, but it's something about listen, the way you want to listen to something, the way you, and it's about nature. It's the same thing about nature. Even if I take Shimon Halkin, Of course it's psychological, of course it's linguistic, but there's something about the way he sees and visions the nature and the landscape. It's not only about, I don't know, of course it's something it's hard to do, but it's not about the object all the time, but it's about the
mode of
The most, can
perception.
I add to that?
Yeah,
Since
exactly.
we're-
Okay, but then I have
What?
to warn you, I have to respond to all of you.
Where is Ariel? Oh, he's gone. So Ariel actually uses the term resonance, which comes from, and he was supposed to remind me, I forgot his name, this German thinker, because he worked on a book that deals with stones, and resonance has this thing which is not exactly verbal, but something resonates with you, and this was just a teaser for Ariel, so that's what it will remain as. But just I'll try to find out exactly the name of the book. And
If I can just continue.
Okay, but I have something to say. I'm like, okay, go.
I think you brought up a really good point about Shklovsky's art as technique and defamiliarization, and
Well,
I think it's one strategy. But what I find interesting in it's this phenomenon that I term the ecological turn, right? It's these new works of Hebrew fiction that try to deal in a different way with human non-human relations. So what I find really interesting is that they're really actively looking for new literary forms, right? For new ways to convey these altered perceptions of the world and of our place within it. And they're really playing both with language and defamiliarization, of course, but also with focalization and with the speakers in both the poems and the narrators. So one really interesting example I can give is of a book called Toldot HaOmanut, Art History by Yossi Waxman, which tells the story of a fire in the Carmel Mountains. And what he does is he tries to describe this fire from a multiple perspective, right? From the perspective of the whole area. And so you have in the first chapter, which is really a masterpiece in my view, every sentence the narrator changes, right? So it's called We, and it begins with, we are the trees who were burned in the fire, etc. We are the wild boars who ran away from the fire. And these are, I don't remember how many pages it is, but you constantly move between different perspectives, and then you get this beautiful ecological whole, and the way this ecological we experiences this natural disaster that, of course, affected everyone. So I think it's really, and it's connected to what I said before. It's about trying to think how we can go outside our, the traditional boundaries, both of language but also of literary forms, to be able to convey this renewed sense of humans in this more than human world. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, okay, and this is sort of leads me to the point. The point is that, and this is maybe I didn't make that explicit enough, was that the ecological turn, the term itself, forces us to think about literary phenomena in supposedly like new terms, whereas actually terms like allegory, defamiliarization, terms that are already established could be more useful. Because as I was reading it, I thought, oh, if you could dedicate more to allegory or allegorical sensibility, at least according to certain interpretations, that could serve your purpose better than, in my again, it's my view.
Well, I'm not
Then
sure, because if you speak about allegory, then you speak about, say, a specific work of literature. But really, when I speak about the ecological turn, this is a literary history term, right? I want to talk about what is happening in the scene of modern
right,
Hebrew
yeah,
literature.
no, I understand,
And there is a turn, right? There is something different happening in new works of fiction that describe the environment.
Yeah, no, I mean, yes, this is a kind of a coda, but what the other thing I wanted to say regarding attentiveness, I assume you're familiar where this is coming from, where this term is coming from. It has it has a history, and it has a deep sort of resonance. I actually, in this book that, that I've written, I've actually gone into this whole, what does it mean, this attentive to the creature? This is a phrase that comes in Benjamin when he talks about Kafka, and he contrasts this. I'm just sort of like want to shed light. He contrasts this with surrealists. This attention to the creature is not what happens with the surrealists. The surrealists, they leave the everyday world. They go into this world of correspondences, into their own sort of subjective mythologies, that they call it. But Benjamin says, like, ultimately, they're not fulfilling, in a way, what he calls a profane illumination, because they're failing to come back to the everyday. So in Kafka, the attentiveness to the creature, it's a little misleading because it's the attentiveness to the everyday. So when Gregor Samsa wakes up in his room and the four walls are still there and the picture is still there, and that's the attentiveness to the creature. It's not attentiveness to animals. It's attentiveness to, it's also, but it's attentiveness to the everyday kind of, and it's developing a span of attention to the everyday from a very sort of detached perspective. So I think that, that sort of rubric has been somewhat misused in when we talk about ecology, because it's really something to do with, in a way, slightly different questions. Just
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting because, when the feminists in animal ethics talk about attentiveness to the animal, they come from a different tradition of thought. Yeah, but I was thinking specifically about Rachel Adams and Josephine Donovan. So, I mean, it's a really interesting thing to contrast, those two different views of attentiveness and attention.
and they're not necessarily contrasting, by the way. I'm just saying there's a whole dimension there and Odysseus, for example, is for Benjamin like this somebody who's, yeah. But I mean, we can talk about that. Okay, so yeah. I hope it's useful. I hope I'm not being too harsh, whatever. But I thought those were things that both papers are really thought provoking, and so I want to talk about your paper. And to me, you know, maybe it's not something I don't understand, but I think that again, I'm looking at the paper as a whole rather than just a more limited lecture. Uh, what was really, really missing for me and what needed more clarification is the relation to romantic poetry in Hebrew. Okay. How is it different exactly? It was really, really missing, like really. Um, I'll tell you what I mean. I'm thinking about especially Bialik and Chernichovsky, and I'm thinking about Bialik Abrecha, the pool, or Chernichovsky Kechom Hayom, but you can find like million others. Leah Goldberg's early poetry, where she is describing. So, for example, you're saying that Regelson's work, you say it stands as one of the most profound attempts by 20th century Hebrew writers to integrate with and acclimatize to a diasporic environment. But I mean, we certainly find that in Bialik. We certainly find that in Chernichovsky and Leah Goldberg's, and I'm sure there are plenty more. So I'm not. So I might be missing out on like what's the criteria? Because when Bialik writes Abrecha, he doesn't write about the Hebrew, like the Israeli landscape. Not at all. Chernichovsky, when he writes about Tichom Hayom, it's not about Israeli landscape. Not at all. It's totally diasporic. You could say what I did find the different is like how they name. This is Maine. I'm an American. So I would definitely agree with that it's kind of like an ideology. Let's write romantic poetry that's not Israeli, right? Like let's do Leah Goldberg, not or maybe even Shlonsky, like if you want to think that far. But I could not. I do think um basically you're saying, for example, Hebrew nationalists Romantic poetry was definitely not confined, right, to the land of Israel due to ideological reasons tied to the Hebrew people. It's not like that the Romantic poets in Hebrew wrote only. That's a bit misleading in my. So I'm not sure. Maybe I misunderstood, but it definitely needs to be more clarified. Because I'm not sure. You see what I mean? Um.
Can I answer before you go move on? Okay. So first of all, you're right. Of course, but in this paper, I intentionally I didn't want to go there because intentionally I didn't want to go to Hebrew historiography. I didn't want to go to the Hebrew discourse. I wanted to go somewhere else and to focus on the local of the New England area. So that's why some of the things that you were talking about are not in the paper. It's not that, and I do think there is something, and we should maybe start reading Bialik and Chernyakhovsky and Goldberg from the eco-critical lens. Maybe we should start. But if we talk about discourse now, nobody talks about it. Okay, or maybe we see.
Yeah. So I can elaborate a little more on that because I want to pursue this a little more. So if you're saying landscape poetry is like a kind of a category, what do we gain when we say it's different from romanticism? Because this sort of goes back to what I said about allegory, right? Like there's already an established form of reading in which many of the things that you described, nature sensibility, landscape consciousness, like an awareness of the psychology and the sort of meeting point between nature and human psychology, that to me seemed more or less, okay, I'm not a stickler, but more or less consonant with romantic sensibility. You could say, and this also brings me to another sort of, in what way are these guys not really sort of adaptations of Longfellow and Thoreau into Hebrew? In what way is their value? What do they bring? And just like one more thing, it's like it seems to me that they're sort of creating an established, like they're really sort of in their poetry, regardless of the quality of their poetry. They're saying basically we can write a Hebrew poetry in America that uh, glorifies American nature, and that the in a way ideological sensibility dictates. So they're creating a poetry that's reminiscent of Chernyakhovsky or Bialik, uh, perhaps, right? I mean, one could think about it. There's significant. There's this idea where another thing when Regelson mentions all these flora and fauna, which is definitely not romantic. Like you're saying he's connecting, but it's precisely non-ecological. The way that he connects is through some kind of instrumental scientific view. So it's even pre-romantic, I would say. Again, correct me if I'm wrong, but there are all kinds of, to me, you're saying like they sort of went ahead of their time, but they're by sticking to Thoreau and sticking to these 19th century models, perhaps even Whitman, even though, because I thought it was very Whitmanesque. Um, I think that they're sort of reclaiming some kind of American heritage piece for Hebrew literature, but in terms of the innovation, or what they bring to Hebrew literature, I was not 100% convinced, except for the fact that they are really, here is Thoreau in Hebrew, sort of like Thoreau in Hebrew.
And that's not.
And that's
No, that could be a lot. I know, but but Yotam's claim is different because he's saying that this is
this is my way to bring them to the focus and to the heart of the canon after everybody ignores them. First of all, okay, so this is important for me, and I think for literary discourse, for Hebrew literature in general. But I think that one of the questions that raises from your comments is, first of all, we have to think about, you're talking about romanticism. We need to think, first of all, the difference between romanticism and transcendentalism, and the difference is there. So first of all, we need to talk about that. And the second thing that we need to think about when talking about it is the local aspect of it. Because when you compare Bialik and Chernyakhovsky to Regelson, Preil, and Halkin, you reduce it to they're just talking about nature, like they're not living somewhere inspired by some landscape, especially, and I don't think you can ignore it. I think it's just so.
I'm not saying that you should ignore it. I'm just saying that the differences should be highlighted. That's why I was missing a discussion of Bialik. I don't think that you disagree with me. I'm just saying when I read the piece, I thought, oh, I would really like to know what you think about this.
I did want it. It's something that I thought about, and I did.
And also transcendentalism. I absolutely agree with.
But I wanted to ignore it, not to ignore it. It's obvious. I think, of course, you go about, and everybody talks about it. The Hebraists, they talk about the influences they had from Chernyakhovsky, from Bialik. So it's a little bit. Maybe I did mention it, and I should have, but yeah, I understand. But I really wanted to go somewhere else that nobody talked about it yet. So.
I think now would be a good time to open the floor to all for questions. I want to say one thing actually about this. One of the things that we know from Jewish literature really across the generations is that this instinct to identify, isn't this just in Hebrew, whatever it is? This is something we've seen many times before. Isn't Yehuda Levi just like good Arabic poetry, but in Hebrew? And the answer sometimes is yes. And then the question is, yes, and like what else is new and what happens with those kinds of cultural transformations that happens when you have what Seidman calls the double situatedness of these thinkers. So even if it is the putting forward or the articulation of an ethos that is well documented in Anglo poetry, so then, I mean, this is the start of something really interesting and powerful. And I'm also not convinced that there aren't actual significant differences. I mean, Hof Santa Barbara is a poem that doesn't look like many other things. So I think we have about 5 more minutes for this particular conversation. We'll take a 10-minute break and then we'll reconvene for the second part, which I think will be the continuation of many of these conversations.
So first of all, I think that I understand the point of reading things through concepts that we already have. But I'm loving the experience of looking for the otherness, and it kind of, for me, just opens up things rather than seeing it in the same. So by itself, the research, the papers were defamiliarizing somehow like that, the way I think about nature in papers about nature. So thank you for that. I think that it would be, your paper really reminded me of Yehuda Amichai, this place will not console us.
Mhm.
And it's I think that it just would be amazing to now go and read the poem through what you've done. And I also wanted to ask you about this whole, does the concept of dress and naked come to mind at all, or is relevant at all to this work? Because it's both the historical and geological time, but it's also the place without the civilization. So kind of naked place versus the. So I wondered if these are relevant concepts, and I wanted to say to you that I loved what you did first, and I loved the way you brought the nature too. So we could, but I totally agree with you that we do not read Romanticism in Hebrew literature in connection to the actual location. That we are so used to thinking about nature as a concept rather than nature as a place. And Bialik himself at some point nature becomes just a concept, when it becomes this is where I don't feel comfortable. And if you think about the poems you read compared to Bialik's, this is where I don't feel comfortable, in the field, in the this, everywhere. I'm a Jew. This is not my, nature. I'm excluded from romanticism. I'm excluded from nature. And this is some kind of an answer that I'm a Jew and I am in nature and I'm not excluded.
Do you wish to respond, or?
No, I think it's not exactly it's to think with what Vered said, but I wrote a book about Gavriel Pride, and I didn't think for 1 minute about the ecological aspect in his writing. And then I started reading some eco-criticism, and then I went back, and I wrote these early poems, and it just changed. It blew my mind. I mean, I just looked at his poems completely different. So, and this is where I started. This was the starting point of all of this research. So, I don't. It's just connected to what you were saying, and it's like, and it's about attentiveness, because I wasn't listening to Prial in a sense. I wasn't, and I wrote a book about it, and I didn't listen to it. And at some point, I understood. Well, I didn't write about the American. I talked about the Yiddish Center and the Hebrew Center and his connections with the poets in Palestine and in Europe, but I didn't think about the place he was living in. I mean, so
that is really for me, not an expert on Prial or anything like that, but that, if you look at the pool, which is like, as you said, an abstract pool, right? It could be anywhere, it could be in, it happens, we know, right, because of the biography, that it's in the diaspora. But even Goldberg, she writes about the river and he writes about the field and so on. We know, but it's kind of like abstract, as you say. And the Regelson, Prial, all these poets make it a point. And that's the Whitmanist sort of inspiration. America.
Yeah.
This is where you breathe. This is where you see. This is where you feel. This is where you can sort of point to the fauna and flora and all that stuff. So that localization, it's kind of also in defiance, as you say, to Zionism and that sort of subordination of the nature to that ideology.
We have about 30 more seconds.
So I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you. I know that it's the tradition of academic places to criticize, but I'm not coming from literature. I finished my literacy or education, I think, in the end of high school, even though I love reading it. So you brought so much beauty. It was like so beautiful. Just, thank you for bringing these materials. It's gorgeous. And I have a question that I don't know if it's like a totally disconnected, but that came to my mind when you were talking, both of you. Just because Israel is such a unique place when you speak about land. It's maybe one of the only places in the world. I know it's not seen like that in the world right now, but like it's maybe one of the only places in the world where you have people going back to ancestral land. So you both were talking about a turn to, like, maybe now we're turning, like Israeli literature is turning with the world, right? Taking like the environmental turn. But I was thinking, I don't know, Ada Gordon kind of like popped into my mind. And I was wondering, like, what are your thoughts? I mean, some of the Zionist thinkers were so innovative so long ago. So they were working in a Zionist framework, but like they were talking about making love with the earth for sure, and like and being like imbued and the importance of like working the embodiness, right? There was like a very deep layer there, and I just wondered, like, how does that play into that turn that you guys are talking about?
Thank you so much
30 seconds.
for this comment. There's actually a really interesting book that just came out about Ada Gordon as the first Jewish environmental philosopher, which we mentioned in our introduction. And I think what happened with that was really similar to what Yotam described when, he was reading Preil and not really listening. So I think we have, our own conceptual frameworks, in our intellectual traditions that we're working in, Israeli literary studies. And now we're sort of going back and rereading so many early writers and thinkers through this ecological frame. And I think Ada Golden is a really good example of that. So thank you.
And I also think that I don't know, maybe because ideology and stuff like that, some of this just disappeared, and we didn't pay attention to it. I mean, Aleph Dalet Golden is a great example, and now when we pay attention to it, we go back and read it differently or think about it because when I don't know, when the literary discourse talked about Aleph Dalet Golden, he talked only about, right, about the להפריח את השממה, right, about העבודה, about what do you do with the land.
יופי של ספר. מישהו מתחיל.
נכון, לא, absolutely.
Now would be a good point to pause. Otherwise, we're going to get no break. So we should break now for 7 minutes, and then we'll come back together.
לא, זה כי זה המקומיות. זה היה בבלון, נכון, ככה הייתי אומר, סליחה.
Okay. On to the second part. Whenever you're ready.
Okay. So, first, very much, Vera and Chen and Yotam, for inviting me to contribute a paper to this wonderful issue of Dibur and to present it here today. But before we discuss a usable past, let me point out that this issue, in the current global situation, is definitely a usable present in the two senses of the word. So thank you all for that. And thank you very much also Shana and Eva, who are not here right now, but yeah, thank you very much. Okay, I would like to begin with Lynn White's 1967 seminal yet controversial paper, The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis, which became a cornerstone in the development of the environmental humanities. Our science and technology, he writes, have grown out of Christian attitudes, and I would add Judeo-Christian attitudes, towards man's relation to nature, which are almost universally held. Despite Copernicus, all the cosmos rotates around our little globe. Despite Darwin, we are not, in our hearts, part of the natural process. We are superior to nature, contemptuous of it, willing to use it for our slightest whim. At the heart of my talk stands our willingness to use, be it natural resources or cultural resources, for what at times can seem as our slightest whim. But first, I want to concentrate on White's conclusion. What we do about ecology depends on our ideas of the man-nature relationship. More science and more technology are not going to get us out of the present ecological crisis until we find a new religion or rethink our old one. And we can think about the last Pope efforts, may rest in peace, regarding this issue. This is a convincing argument, but how should such a rethinking process be done? Religion is not just a collection of beliefs and ideologies, but also pieces of literature. And literature, religious or not, has its own dynamics. Reading Talmudic literature, for example, with White's argument in mind, raises uneasy questions. What would environmental reading in this literature look like? What distinct poetic and historical aspects should be considered? To what extent does this literature contain pre-humanist elements, as Mira Balberg, for example, suggests? Might this literature be less anthropocentric than modern literature, despite its focus on what Jonas Frankel justifiably defined as the drama of the individual, which means the drama of the human being? Of course, rethinking Talmudic literature in such a way is not limited to environmental issues. In his influential work, Carnal Israel, Reading Sex in Talmudic Literature, certainly a different issue, Daniel Boyarin concludes with a similar crucial insight. My assumption is that we cannot change the actual past. We can only change the present and the future, in part by changing our understanding of the past. Unless the past is experienced merely as a burden to be thrown off, then constructing a monolithically negative perception of the past and cultivating anger at it seem to be counterproductive and disempowering for change. Finding only misogyny in the past reproduces misogyny. Finding only a lack of female power, autonomy, and creativity reifies female passivity and victimhood. In contrast to this, recovery of those forces in the past that oppose the dominant androcentrism can help put us on a trajectory of empowerment for transformation. Boyarin demonstrates how texts of late antiquity can be used to extract a usable past, while discovering and marking out those areas within the past, within the culture, that can serve us today, and finding ways to contextualize and historicize recalcitrant and unpalatable aspects of the culture, such that we can move beyond them. But the issue we are discussing today places us in a completely different position in relation to the past compared to Boyarin's stance, and the difference is fascinating. In the feminist context, Boyarin confronts a past that seems, in the end, less progressive than our present. It is not easy to identify with contemporary values while returning to an objectifying androcentric ancient literature to search for fragments of text that might speak in a different voice, sometimes only through a heroic and brilliant interpretation. From this perspective, Carmen Israel, a seminal work in contemporary Talmudic studies, represent a justifiable David and Goliath struggle against what Boyarin calls the arrogance of cultural Darwinism, which posits the idea that culture evolves from less advanced to more advanced forms. However, the fact that there is a Goliath to fight with, the fact that much of Talmudic literature can be read as being less feminist than one might hope, indicates that cultural Darwinism is not entirely baseless, at least with respect to gender. In the environmental context, the situation is almost entirely reversed. Here, despite the historical roots discussed by White, we are the past. Our era is marked by recalcitrant and unpalatable aspects from which we need to distance ourselves. Our carbon footprint is as vast as Goliath's mythological one, and sometimes it seems that what we need most is a David from the past to throw a stone at our foreheads and remind us for our limitations. This would definitely be a usable past. However, as both White and Boyarin teach us, our cultural past is far more complex. Let's discuss a concrete example. The do not destroy prohibition, Bal Tashchit, as formed in Talmudic literature. From the Middle Ages onwards, this principle was seen in Jewish law as a prohibition against destroying all kinds of natural resources. However, the late antique origins suggest a slightly different understanding. This concept offers a perfect case study for exploring how an original biblical principle, which could be read as a usable ecological past, undergoes a Talmudic transformation through legal discourse and narrative development that radically change it. The main text I will examine comes from the Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Shabbat. At first glance, this Talmudic passage seems irrelevant for our discussion here. It asks when it is permissible to light a fire on Shabbat for medical purposes, specifically for a person suffering from chills after bloodletting. Rav Chia bar Ravin said, that Shmuel said, one who let blood and cut cords, one makes a fire for him on the Shabbat, even during the season of Tammuz. Typically for the Talmuds, the permission is worded to include extreme cases. Even on the hottest summer Shabbats, one can light a fire for a suffering person. But equally typically, this permission is explored through a chain of miniature strange stories, which transform the subject from Shabbat law into a different realm. When Shmuel underwent bloodletting, they broke for him a wooden armchair made of teak to build a fire. Similarly, for the sake of Rav Yehuda, they broke a wooden table made of ebony. For Rabbah, they broke a bench. And the Abai said to Rabbah, in breaking the bench, didn't the master violate the prohibition, do not destroy? Rabbah said to him, do not destroy my body is preferable to me. The Talmud tells here about 3 sages who suffered from the cold after bloodletting, and people lit a fire for them by burning expensive furniture, as if no other combustible material could be found. The last one, Rabbah, was criticized by his student, Abaye. Isn't this act violating the do not destroy prohibition? The teacher's remarkable answer sounds almost like contemporary discussions about sustainability. Against the seemingly ecological needs, there are other needs that should be considered seriously. Destroying one's body is one of them. But is it so? Was there really no other choice but to hastily burn an expensive piece of furniture following an unsurprising medical procedure? If the sage had been in real danger, no one would have doubted the act. Yes, we know all the concept of pikuach nefesh. But the student's doubt suggests that here was, well, an event not entirely bound by reality. The three events together, then, appear to describe whimsical situation with a strong connection to bodily needs, as do many stories in the Babylonian Talmud. And there is more here. The term Bal Tashchit derives from Deuteronomy 20, which prohibits cutting down trees during warfare. When in your war against a city, you have to besiege it a long time in order to capture it. You must not destroy its trees, wielding the axe against them. Interestingly, the biblical prohibition frames the tree as a subject, while comparing it to a human being. For is a tree of the field a man, that it should be besieged by you? The tree is likened to a human, precisely to emphasize that, unlike a human enemy, it deserves protection. In what may be a later layer in the biblical text, according to Alexander Offe, the prohibition is limited to fruit trees only. The passage carries particular poignance for us today in the midst of such extreme violence, when people and trees are being shown no mercy, and we understand how nothing in this commandment can be taken for granted. What's particularly surprising is the gap between this severe biblical prohibition and the Talmudic miniature story. This melodramatic story doesn't depict a siege during wartime and has nothing to say about fruit trees. Rather, it outlines a prohibition against damaging wooden furniture. One could almost say a prohibition against damaging the assets of the bourgeoisie. And this prohibition, too, is fairly limited by a representative of this ancient bourgeoisie anxious about his delicate body. I cannot offer a detailed philological analysis of this prohibition's evolution from biblical origins to Talmudic formulation. Such analysis can be found in the full paper. What I do want to emphasize, however, is how this formulation was affected by one of the most fundamental forces of the Babylonian Talmud's poetics, its tendency toward dramatic, sometimes melodramatic, exaggerated narration, a tendency that, in the end, shaped the law itself. Notice, for example, how a simple but colorful plot is here set against the dry law. How history turns an ethical tension into a narrated unusual reality. Expensive wooden furniture is impulsively broken, and the following dialogue between Abba and Rabba is not an entirely academic one. Rabba's short statement, "Do not destroy my body," is preferable to me, not only establishes a new hierarchy that prioritizes body comforts over resource conservation by using the very same words, but also reflects a personal sensitivity. Abaye's critique, which calls for a balanced approach to resource use, is ultimately set aside in favor of Rabba's bodily needs, not needs arising from some life-threatening situation, merely the needs for well-being. This evolutionary arc is revealing a biblical usable past with radical potential regarding nature, protect trees even during warfare, undergoes reduction in the Talmud and becomes a recommendation to preserve property, that is, culture, when it is convenient to do so. Our story takes this logic to its extreme, providing justification for eliminating the prohibition entirely when it conflicts with bodily comfort. Yet, the reduction was not complete. The text lacks a definitive last word. Abaye's critique continues to be heard alongside the teacher's ruling. This dialectical tension preserved the space for different formulations of the prohibition in later Jewish thought to this day. Returning to Lynn White's challenge, what can we learn from this example? Yes, we can see how Talmudic discourse may have contributed to shaping our sense of superiority over nature. We can see how the slightest whim is indulged, but we also see how poetic conventions, rather than just ideologies, participate in this process and complicate it. A few years ago, while revisiting his own work, Glenn Love reminded us that an integral aim of eco-criticism is to keep finding out what it means to be human. In this spirit, I believe the idea of narrative as a device for exploring what it means to be a human, and this is what narrative is all about, gives the Talmudic text a special meaning. This text, with all its anthropocentrism, still preserves an unfinished dialogue, a vital story that embodies the conflict between human needs and environmental responsibilities and calls upon us to rethink this old tradition. At the end of the day, the search for usable past is essentially an act of recycling. In this case, an abstract recycling. But, as with any recycling process, drawing on the past doesn't necessarily mean preserving it in its original form. Sometimes decomposition and transformation are necessary. Only through such processes can the past fertilize the present, even when the differences between them are undeniable. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. The argument of my essay on animals as teachers is pretty simple. While animals were once a keystone species upon the landscape of Jewish thought and theology, I find it striking that our non-human companion species are really absent from so much of contemporary Jewish life and thought, and until recent years from Jewish studies as an academic discipline. This effacement, in some respects, is a spiritual and intellectual symptom of urbanization, of industrialization, of a gradual distancing from the animal world that has occurred in tandem with the commodification of non-human creatures as inert objects or as resources from which profit and goods may be extracted. This commodification has transpired in tandem with another grave and swiftly increasing process, and that is the extinction of animal species and the overall loss of biodiversity, a phenomenon now occurring at an almost unprecedented rate. In what amounts to a terrible reversal of the Cambrian explosion, we're now being left with fewer species and a much smaller individual median biomass. The collapse of the diversity of life on this planet is already transforming our landscapes and our oceans, often in unpredictable ways, but it's also reshaping our minds and our cultures. Sometimes this is called everything from species loneliness to what Vandana Shiva has felicitously described as the monoculture of the mind. The cultural work of addressing climate change, including the moral blight of factory farming and mass extinction, demands that we offer new, or better, old new, visions of human entanglement with the world around us. Renouncing the mistaken myth of human apartness, we must come to read texts in a way that reflects ourselves as a part of the house, the oikos of ecology. It also means, as a discipline, coming to read religious sources in conversation with the full range of environmental and biological sciences, as well as other disciplines like law, philosophy, political science, anthropology, and education. Our fundamental terrestrial integration within the animal world situates us within a network of kinship and connection, a web of relationship that carries with it a set of rights, duties, and obligations. So in the paper, I explore texts that depict animals as teachers and as revealers of what is called divine wisdom, an often overlooked theme in the study of Jewish thought. I highlight those Jewish traditions that draw a porous and permeable boundary in between human and non-human creatures, one that is defined by entanglement and collective multi-species learning rather than hierarchy and power. And rather than depicting animals purely as sources of danger or as objects of extraction or even compassion, these traditions look at animals as creative subjects, possessing their own wisdom and discernment, revealing divinity and serving as a source of learning and education for those around them. I suggest that reconceiving animals as agents of revelation offers a striking way to rethink the nature of creaturely being and the possibilities of interspecies communication. And this perspective, I hope, also places significant moral and behavioral demands upon us. Becoming sensitive to these ongoing processes of sacred revelation requires us to actively reattune, to reclaim our capacity for careful and empathetic listening, rethinking communication and kinship across species bonds as one that is founded in an obligation of care and reciprocity. Evolutionary biologists have suggested that the foundational concept of fitness, an organism's ability to successfully reproduce, need not be restricted to single individuals. Groups of kin cooperate to raise young, even when their genetic connection is distant or even absent. So this raises the question, building on Peter Singer's admonition to expand our circles of responsibility, to extend this further by considering ourselves morally compelled to ensure the survival of our more than human kin. There are, of course, great hazards in approaching animals as teachers, including projection, anthropomorphism, although I am party to the argument that we have maybe perhaps over-eschewed anthropomorphism given its pedagogical value. There's also the risk of reducing animals to nothing more than mythic symbols on one hand, or as passive objects for human inspiration on the other. As living kin in bodies, animals are neither abstractions nor metaphors. Interspecies learning requires a frank encounter with the real bodies, both strange and familiar, that requires humility, receptiveness, and results, I hope, in an ethic of care. Scientists have documented countless instances of creatures teaching behaviors and modes of expression to one another, a phenomenon that supports this much contested notion of animal culture. Humpback whales teach and transmit songs to members of other groups and pods. Certain populations of orcas, whose forms of communication include local and familial dialects, teach their young to go up onto land and to catch prey in a terrifying technique known as intentional stranding. Has anyone seen a picture of this? When an orca comes out of the water and goes onto land to grab a seal, it's the seal's worst nightmare. But it's not a skill that they know how to do. It's a skill that has to be taught because it's not shared with all orca groups, and it requires an enormous degree of parental investment because the young juveniles actually need help to get back into the water when they're learning this. And we know from contemporary research that stingless bees build their hives using architectural designs that are passed down within colonies and communities. Alongside this type of intraspecies skill building, which is called social learning, biologists have also developed a conceptual framework for how animals gain knowledge by watching and interacting with other species. This process is perhaps unsurprisingly called heterospecific social learning, is far from uncommon among the creatures among us. Animals observe other species to gain knowledge about how to deal with new problems, how to recognize new food sources, how to identify and escape predators, and thus increase their own chances for survival. This ecology of learning, this constant recycling of knowledge, includes our own story. And this returns us to the question of Jewish sources on divine wisdom. In the animals, which can be read as framing this knowledge as a mode of both divine inspiration, but also something that is very specific and can be learned from those particular animals in very particular ways. Undergirding this project is the through line of Jewish thinking, in which revelation is understood not as a single moment in time, but as an unfolding project, one that begins with creation rather than with the encounter of God and Israel at Sinai, and one in which Torah is seen more as more than just a book of precepts and narratives, but as a kind of radiant, shimmering undercurrent of divine wisdom found in the natural world. Ancient revelation was possible precisely because God's voice is manifest everywhere and in all times, a presence that endures forever and unfolds across the generation. So to illustrate this point, let me just move to one example. Rabbi Yochanan says, according to the Talmud, even if the Torah had not been given, we would have learned various traits from the cat and the ant and all sorts of things, the dove and the rooster. You can look it up. It need not concern, the specifics need not concern us now at this moment. Had scripture not been delivered at Sinai, Rabbi Yochanan asserts, scholars of tradition could have derived its central ethical dimensions just by looking at the animals around them. Now, I understand that theologians and scholars, especially those in the humanities, are often far too sanguine or naive in portraying the animal world as home to an ethic of harmony and balance. Nature, I know, is read in tooth and claw, and philosophers have argued against reading ethics into the animal world. But the notion of animal morality has received growing attention in recent years, and the idea that animals can have moral lives and can function as ethical agents can no longer be handily or cursorily dismissed. I want to be mindful of time here, so I'm just going to skip just a little bit and suggest that one other way of reading the tradition from Rabbi Yochanan would be, rather than seeing the animals as confirming the Torah that had been given at Sinai, what if we were to open up an idea that iterations of Torah, that new faces of Torah, here, and I'm thinking with the traditions of the Kabbalists that talk about the 70 faces, or the 600,000 faces, or the infinite faces and garments of Scripture, what if we were then to dream of additional faces of Torah that emerge from the teachings of the animals, lessons that are specific to that species and deeply rooted in the particular Umwelt, the environment, but yes, the way of looking at and engaging with it, the capacities and their ways of existing within the world? We would then find ourselves radically surrounded by opportunities for heterospecific social learning, immersed then in a world saturated by wisdom and with teachers. Given that obligations are a cornerstone of Jewish theology as well as rabbinic law, what responsibilities might these new faces of the infinite and ever-flowing Torah place upon us? In becoming apprenticed to the natural phenomena that surround us, to use Barry Lopez's felicitous word, we have creatures and trees and rivers and stones that become our teachers and partners in making sense of the world. It's unfortunate to do this indoors, but time spent indoors confines our vision, while new vistas open as we consider the riparian corridors, the prairies, the old-growth forests, the ponds, and their inhabitants as well. We read in the words of one Talmudic story, and this I will quote inside. It's also one of the stories that Ruth Calderon begins her book about Talmudic stories with. Rav comes to a certain place. He decrees a fast, but the rain does not come. The prayer leader descends before him and recites, "He who makes the wind blow," and the wind blew. He says, "Who makes the rain fall," Mashiva Ruach, Moed Geshem, and the rain comes. Rav says, "What are your deeds? What's so special about you that makes your prayer so effective?" This person says, "I'm a teacher. I'm a teacher of children. I teach Bible to the children of the poor just like I teach it to the children of the rich. If someone cannot pay, I don't take anything." It's what we would call, in contemporary terms, sliding scale tuition. "For any child who is struggling, I have a pond with a school full of fish. I win that student over with my fish. I calm the child and soothe them until they learn to read." Children and adults who struggle within the classroom remind us of the necessity of looking beyond its confining walls. Calmed by the presence of the water and the fluttering movements of the fish, perhaps what this young voyager learns first is not how to intone the alphabet, but to read and interpret the world around him. What specific lessons might that fish in the fish in the teacher's pond impart? How might they prompt us to reflect, to expand our awareness, to deepen our emotional engagement? Here, I think we need to rewild or embellish and transform our understanding of the notion of schools in the sense as it applies to both fish life and to marine mammals. I read here from the book by Alexis Pauline Gumbs, Undrowned. It's an amazing book. I commend it to all of you. Dolphin schools are organizational structures for learning, nurturance, and survival, both intergenerationally and within generations. What if the word school, as we use it on a daily basis, signal not the name of a process or an institution through which we could be indoctrinated, not a structure through which social capital is grasped or policed, but something more organic, like a scale of care? Fish remind us of interrelation, of connection, of the way that landscapes and species transform and shift across the generations. Like the act of gazing into the pool in T.S. Eliot's Burnt Norton, watching the fish, just like watching the birds, allows for an entirely different understanding of time, of growth, and of cycles of engenderment. The paper argues for the central importance of interspecies learning, of listening, of attention, of cultural restoration of animals to their rightful place in Jewish theological discourse and environmental thinking. I'll come here to a close. Rather than merely identifying or adopting wholesale responses from these classical teachings, of course, I approach these texts as ethical prompts. They're not simply a nudge toward a particular action, but as texts that spark within us a process of thinking, of reflection, and discernment. And these arguments, I hope, also have implications for law and regulatory policy, because approaching animals as subjects rather than objects offers an interesting pathway toward legal rights that doesn't depend on similarity to human qualities or perceptions of personhood. Accepting and embracing the full animality or animalhood of our fellow creatures provides a much-needed corrective to the terrible limitations of the Endangered Species Act, which, when I wrote this, still stood and has just been eviscerated by the Trump administration. Even if that act were not so fragile and poorly enforced, it's woefully inadequate for addressing the complexities of extinction caused by global climate change. So here I suggest that religious sources, Jewish literatures in general, ought to be included within broader university-wide conversations related to ecology, biology, wildlife conservation, and environmental education. While conservation requires careful biological study and precise political policy, perhaps it also demands careful theological engagement. With the collapse of biodiversity, we lose staggering numbers of opportunities to hear what the Kabbalists would describe as the resonance of God's voice. In failing our responsibility to protect them, we live in relationship with them, we are guilty of a violence and deprived of essential kin. With their fallen bodies, we lose possibilities of wisdom, opportunities to stretch our moral imagination and to learn new skills, and with them to the chance to transform our ways of acting in the world. So maybe Itay, you should join us here. And Naama, you can respond.
Well, thank you both. It's a pleasure to read your papers. And respond a little bit. So because we're after a lot of talk, I thought that I'll start with a short story. And I know that I only have 10 minutes. I'll be pretty short. About 4 years ago, so my name is Naama, and I mostly learned environmental education policy. So that's what I did in my dissertation. About 4 years ago, I was in this big conference, North American Association for Environmental Education. And that the theme that year was like indigenous knowledge. It became a big thing in environmental education, which used to be basically science education. So environmental education was communicated as science most of the time, and then indigenous knowledge starts coming in, and indigenous wisdom. People are like, "Oh my gosh, it's so amazing! People have ideas about like nature and human connections." And okay, so that conference, they bring all kinds of like indigenous people. I'm going into one of the sessions, and they ask everybody to identify either as a settler or an indigenous person. And I'm Israeli, and I live in America, and I'm like, what? Indigenous settler? I don't know. So of course, people had their own ideas, I think, but I was like really kind of like startled by it. And okay, I'm like feeling a lot of emotions, and I'm going to the main session. In the main session, they have this woman from Oklahoma, a storyteller of a tribe, and she's coming to the stage, and she's like amazing. She's sitting there. She has a drum, and she's like starting to drum. It's really cool. And she's like, I love to share stories. Stories are how we are like building our culture, and I love to share stories from other cultures as well. And today I want to share with you a really special story, the story from a person called Rabbi Nachman. Okay, so then she tells the story of the Hindik, if you know it. But like, I was like, whoa, okay? That was a moment of validation that I felt like, okay, I might be like a settler and indigenous and everything at the same time. And it was really nice to hear it. I'm telling that story to say that there's a really deep need that is now also being voiced in many environmental stages to go back to what some people call pre-industrial knowledge, right? Pre-industrial wisdom, because we kind of understand that we can't find our solutions just through technology and science. And people are like understanding that we have to do, in addition to the fact that we do need engineers that can like do problem solving, we also need culturalists that can do culture work, right? Because things have to be more integrative, more holistic. We have to understand what we're even talking about and our assumptions. So the way I kind of like understand it from the world of environmental policy, at least, there are like three things that culture can really do and really we need it to do. One is to create just like places where we can see we can have the eco lenses, right, to our culture. So that will mean like, okay, every culture is so rich and so full of so many elements. How can we even see the animals? So I think in that regard, your paper is really doing a good service to that cause. Someone needs to go and collect all the stories about animals and put them in eco lenses so that you can see it through eco lenses. And you're like, oh, wow, I know this story. Of course I heard the story about the school of fish so many million times, but I never thought about it through these kind of lenses, right? So first of all, we need someone to collect it and just kind of like reiterate it. So that's one task. The other task is really the task of like giving analytical tools. So I think that many times it's true. We kind of like have a greenwash of like, or the way I thought about it is like, you have the goal already on the wall, and now you're just surrounding it. So many times people were like, oh yeah, of course, Jewish thought always spoke about environmentalism. Here's my evidence. But the truth is, of course, it's not true, right? It's like it's kind of like I don't know, imposing your own thoughts about ancient tradition. So in that regard, I found your article so helpful because you're basically saying you have to be honest when you read these kind of things. You have to be honest and you have to be intricate when you read these things. And I think that your paper really gives like such a deep analytical tool to work with these kind of texts where you're saying, I can't just read it for the goals that I want. I need to read it to read it. And the way I find now these kind of ideas here, maybe in 20 years I'll find something different. But if I have the literary tools, then maybe I'll be able to actually understand better what's happening here. The third one, I think, is to explore the relevance and impact. So because of our time limitations, I'll just offer two thoughts about things that I would have loved to understand or thought that were like need a little more expression, but I really enjoyed it. It was beautiful, beautifully read. This was like reading poetry, and this was like reading I don't know the word for it in English, but like משהו כל כך מהודק. So that was really a really great aesthetic experience. So for you, Ariel, you're asking why is it then that we seem so unwilling to translate this deep longing, this yearning for connection, into collective action and regulatory or legislative transformation? And my sense is like that this is the wrong question for your paper. And I wonder how you can connect that. I'll explain what I'm trying to say. So coming from environmental policy, for example, there's a very big gap between the texts of the policy and the integration in the culture. Both works are so important, right? Just to create these texts is like a really big work that then percolates and needs a lot of cultural work to bring into the reality of people. But these are two different things. So in policy, we call it like policy making and policy implementation or policy integration. And the first one is more about politics, maybe. The second one is more about governance and organization. So my question to you is like, either how do you think to connect these like very elaborate text work that you've done to cultural life, like rituals, for example, but like more than that? Or, yeah, so that's my question to you. And to you, first of all, I don't like the use of recycling.
Okay.
But that's just a personal preference because I think recycling, as Ariel said, is like mostly nonsense usually. But in that regard, I'm saying that because there is something so deep there. And recycling is kind of like saying, okay, let's take it and reuse it again. But really what you're doing is a different thing, right? You are doing like decomposting and reintegration. So for you, my question is, so Mike Holm, who's like a very big scientist, but also wrote a paper, Meet the Humanities, like he understands the humanities exist. He just wrote a book called something like Climate Change is Not Everything. But he's basically saying you have to look through a more complex lens. And he encourages people to think about clumsy solutions. It's like you can't have this like climatism, right? Ism ideology, looking at everything and think that will just explain everything. It becomes very flat and it's just not adapted to people's lives. You have to have clumsy solutions. You have to like be able to. So in that regard, I feel like you're taking like literary principles and you're reading a local sugya. So I would love to hear from you more. I mean, you give there one sugya, but like, what do you think about kind of like implementing these kind of like clumsy readings and rich readings that are not recycling, but are recomposting maybe in other places? So
I don't think it's the only question that the paper is asking, but it is a question that really preoccupies me. And, our conversations about the applied humanities mean that question is just always there, sort of rattling around in my brain. And I'll say that the sequel to this paper, or the next part of it, is actually a law review article that I'm writing with another person about rethinking the notion of non-human personhood and standing in the law. And so going back to Charlie Stone's famous book on Should the Trees Have Standing, and thinking about the way in which American law actually, in the dissenting opinions around certain Sierra Club decisions and others, there were paths that didn't get taken, but it's like the Minority Report, and it's there in legal tradition, and it's been almost effaced and largely forgotten. But a passage in Eduyot about why we retain the opinions of the minority, which is that so we don't make that mistake again, since we've gone over this ground and we no longer need to keep it, or two, it's there for when we need it. That's actually the way that dissent works at the Supreme Court level and at other levels. So the questions that I asked in this paper got me thinking about that project, and that's where I think, at least in my small way of like thinking, provides a different kind of more practically oriented solutions. How that works in terms of broader culture, geez, I don't know.
It will be kind of a personal answer, but I would say that the entire of my work has a tension in it between my willingness to read local small fragments of text and my willingness to read everything. And since I'm also a digital humanist, although I don't like the title, so I feel that I have to read everything, but then I also have to problematize everything. And I think that my work here is dedicated to the idea of how to problematize the reading of Talmudic text as an ecological text. Now, we have some clearly ecological passages, right? You can think about Ta'anit, right? The question of Chonim Agel, etc., etc. But here I decided not to go to these places, but to go to other places in the Talmudic tradition, in which it might be even more challenging to find eco teachings. And I find it more than everything else a question of how to be honest to yourself, to your time, to the text you read. So I don't know if it is a good answer, but
It's a very moving answer. Does everyone have 5 more minutes? Should we continue for 5 more minutes? Okay. Yeah, great. So we should throw open the floor.
First of all, thank you. It was really beautiful, and thank you for making us think about all these
Right.
things. So I really like the combination of ethics and listening to the animals, and it somehow going back to the sources, because that's something we've been doing now. Is I was thinking about Yom LeYom Yabia Omer and Laila Laila something Bilti Nishma Kulam. So, and I was thinking about it right now when you talk exactly at the same together with the first murder, right? And we don't have the dialogue before the first murder. We just have the murder, and we know that they talked, but what happened, we don't know. So I think it's just like this moment of ethics. Suddenly, the Yom LeYom feels like this moment of ethics in which you actually need to bring your own listening and resonance, and it's not going to be, nobody's going to tell you that exactly. So just thinking about that. The other thing is whether and that's a question, do we have too much of a rosy look at the natural world? And I could think of incidents in which, we are nicer to animals than we are to humans. And so, like, yeah, how do we not fall into the trap of looking at the natural world and saying, okay, that's actually better or more ethical? And my last thing, and these things could be to everybody here, and the last question is about the question of place. For biologists, there is no native really to a place. It's just, it happens that this DNA worked really well in this place. This plant worked really nicely in this place. And if you move it to another place, it actually could be even better, or it could be all worse. It's all, there's no good or bad or belonging. It's all a matter of this combination. And yeah, so how do we manage with this question? That's maybe for you. How do we manage this question of native and not native if we want to work with the biological concept? So there were a lot of questions. You could answer to whatever you want, if at all.
It's great. I mean, biology talks about invasive species, and yet everything that exists pretty much anywhere on a continent was once an invasive species. You just have to go back far enough. We crawled out of the oceans, right? So this is absolutely true. And adaptation in response to a place is the other side of that coin. Animals flourish in particular places, plants flourish in particular places. They move from place to place, but they're also shaped by that place, right? Like polar bears are brown bears that move north and then over 100,000 years totally transformed in relationship to the place where they were living. So I think it actually raises a really interesting question about indigeneity, which is not about some like essential being in the land, but rather a kind of adaptive relationship in dialogue with a particular place, which I find much more convincing than much of the discourse around indigeneity, which for me feels very resonant of blood/land, which I know from elsewhere. Cain and Abel. There's a great story. It's in Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer and elsewhere. When Adam and Chava are sitting Shiva, they don't know what to do with their child because they've never had to bury anyone. So they see two ravens fly by, and one of them dies, and the other one buries it. And now they know what to do with their child, which there was just a dissertation. It is in the paper. But I hate when people say, well, as I said in my paper, there was just a dissertation about corvidae, that's the raven and crow families, and burial rituals. And this question about whether or not that's the right word, but there are behaviors around this which are really, really interesting. But they're like the most human thing, right? How we deal with death and confront death, we learn it from the animals. And obviously, there are huge hazards in rose-tinted glasses looking at the natural world. There's like stuff there that I wouldn't really love to see learned from into human society. On the other hand, I'm going to do the Maimonidean thing. Yeah, it is true that we are nicer to certain animals than we are to certain human beings. On the whole, more land is devoted to using animals as resources and factory farming than to any other purpose. And that's not something that we do to other people. We do that in different ways. Okay, well, capitalism might just be that. I'm happy to talk about that, in which case we are in agreement. But I think it is a matter of opening up a kind of listening and learning which allows for those possibilities. But at the end of the day, the approach to the subjecthood or the individuation of these creatures is one that rises or falls not on like the value of something that we learn from them, but really on the fact that they exist. And this is what Martha Nussbaum argues in her book, Justice for Animals, right? She goes through the different ways that people have approached this. People say, oh, animals that are kind of like us deserve rights. So that's orcas and apes and elephants. And then there are ones that feel pleasure or pain. That's the utilitarian argument. So if they feel either of those, then we have to treat them nicely. And she feels that both of those are perhaps severely lacking. And so she applies to the animal realm what she developed in the economic world, the capabilities approach to economic development of approaching each species as capable of species-specific flourishing. And that in and of itself is what we owe to them.
These things are like, there's so much to play with it. And just, we feel more in community with humans than with non-humans, but you can apply the same things. Like we feel more in community with humans from our nationality. We're willing to hurt people from other nationalities. There's something there also about, like, I think human nature that we're discussing when we're thinking about ecological, which is basically sharing space. And there's a power question. And yeah, and belonging.
I would add that with all our wish to be more biocentric oriented than anthropocentric. It is not only difficult, but I would say that I don't want to avoid anthropocentrism entirely. I thought about it yesterday when I walked around the Golden Gate Bridge, and I found myself thinking about Tehillim Kuf Daled, Barchi Nafshi, maybe the most ecological chapter in the Bible. And I thought that in the same pasuk we found שם אוניות יהלכון, לוויתן זה יצרת לשחק בו. And I was suddenly surprised. I mean, we see only animals around this pasuk, and suddenly אוניות. But I think that the poet behind Tehillim, he think about אוניות as well as Leviathan as two creatures. I would say that can. Yes.
I read that poem 12 times a year at least, and I've never thought of it in that context. Thank you.
So Oniot and technology is part of the story.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think sometimes, and that's how we're taught, like we're thinking about ecological decisions is like, for example, are you real ecological? Are you a person that cares about the environment? If you use the can, if you use plastic, use this, right? Like, so a lot of times, like, is this a yes or no question, right?
Well, it's a light bulb.
No, and I think the thing with like the Oniot and the Leviathan is like that in the end, ecological decisions are always like in a bigger matrix. And you can't always see the whole thing, but like, I think that's my Holmes' point. Mm-hmm. It's like, you have to be able to move not Yamina Vesmola, but like in kind of like a bigger place. Like in my life, is this like, right, there's really like fascinating studies, for example, on Haredim in Israel. Like they are using like Chad Pami and Chitulim and all these things, but like then like they're not driving for the most part because they're poor. So they have less cars. They're walking. They live in smaller places. So like these things kind of like balance each other. Not that I'm advocating for Chad Pami, but I'm just saying like that the questions are always like ecology are in a bigger network, and they do kind of like bring up a question of like how much am I willing to compromise my needs for society, my needs now for like future. There's like big questions there that I'm not usually always so even aware of. And this is why this kind of work is like so important, to even bring it to awareness that like, oh, these things exist. It's part of my cultural world. And I need to start like thinking about them also eventually in like technical terms.
There was two questions for Ariel and one for Itay. And the one thing I wanted to say about it kind of resonates with me. One thing I'd be really interested in learning more about from you is the relation to mimesis. This has been implied in across several passages, especially of course with the crows, right? They're mimicking the crows, burial, are to what degree, and also in the notion of learning and reading done in nature. The reading of nature promotes reading because you learn how to read nature, then you do the same thing. So how does that all sort of connect with mimesis? The second thing that I was kind of wondering, and you probably know this, but as that in pre-modern law, animals were legal subjects, right? Like dogs could be accused of murder and rape and all kinds of stuff like that. Yeah, they're put on trial. Sometimes they're executed. Today, it seems. So those are considered, not exactly great or very progressive practices. To what, where do you draw the line between like looking at the we talked about the legal persona. These people actually took dogs seriously, right? Or wolves. They hanged the wolves. Is that a good thing, so to speak? Like, do we hold them accountable? So those are the two questions. And then the one question I had for Itay, which was like that Ki Adam Etz Hasadeh. Actually, I wanted like a question for clarification, which was actually that quote. I don't know if it came out in the English. That quote, in the Hebrew at least, meant if I'm reading it correctly, that you can kill the person, you can besiege you can put the person under siege, but the tree you can't. So why is the
It's
tree
in the paper.
right? No, I know.
No,
Oh,
just
it's in the
got
paper.
just
Which he
came
has.
out. No,
So
no,
what is
okay.
the reason that, what's the privilege of the tree over the human being? You see what I mean? Why can you besiege a human being where it wasn't quite clear to me? So
In terms of the legal subjecthood or the personhood of the animals, um, yeah, obviously that's not great in a certain sense, especially given that it was all a kind of, retributive justice and a theory in which someone had to pay for these particular crimes. And on the other hand, I mean, you both brush that against the grain and also don't in order to have to recover something very useful from it, which is that part of the revolution that happened in the intervening time, which I talked about in the paper, um, is this sort of like post-Cartesian way of looking at animals, from Descartes to Skinner as nothing more than machines, and the unwillingness to hold them accountable on the one hand, but also to approach them as any kind of, let's call them autonomous subjects. So in that sense, I think there's actually something very important about returning to seeing that. And in this book, Nussbaum actually talks a little bit about that, although um, there are some significant problems with the argument, at least in my eyes, in thinking about the way in which attorneys would function for those animals as ombudsmen, what we would call in like contemporary terms. They would speak on the behalf of the animals. Um, Now thinking about the poem about who am I to speak on behalf of, and the other side of that is that um, there was this amazing and awful Supreme Court decision a number of years ago, not that many years ago in America, about 15 years ago, that allowed corporations to have legal personhood, which means they're subject to all of the rights and very few of the obligations. Um, and so, like, the courts have a clear precedent for granting personhood to things that are very different than individual, like, tax-paying citizens, because corporations don't pay taxes anyway. But that's there, and the work of legal historians is very much the same work of how do you look into the past in order to, like, open up this box that we're stuck in? And it's also the case with comparative law. When you feel like you're stuck in a particular situation, you look horizontally to other ways of doing things, at least ideally, to be able to move beyond this. Um, and I think that, okay, back to the first point about mimesis. I think I don't address it because I mean, I honestly don't know that much about it. Can you tell me just a little bit more and then,
the idea
Yeah.
is a certain notion of how we learn to read the stars,
Yeah.
how we learn to read the future, like the
Okay.
more, like the more.
Yeah.
So the very act of reading is basically through some mimicry, like astrology is some kind of like the relations that are found in nature are then sort of elaborated into language until those correlations were the mimetic. So they kind of had
Right.
like these connection to nature. They had these magical kind of quality. But with language, it's kind of being in a way rationalized or loses. It's become more contractual
Yeah.
or exchange. Because why do we need language, right? Hi, hi, come to your house. Can you give me bread? I'll give you water, and that kind of thing. Uh, but in a way, language somehow, and this is what I think that's what you were kind of aiming for to, you know, to go to the prehistory of language, right? And sort of excavate an original sort of connection, mimetic connection to things and to animals. And that was perfectly reflected in that crow. Like, so basically the rituals, the language, the whole significance in which sort of human life is embedded is a product of the mimetic capacity. The mimetic capacity is what allows us to read to begin with, like to read meaning into why do we need the ritual? What is the meaning of burying someone? Only because it's mimetic. Without the mimesis underlying the signifier, so to speak, we don't have the signified. The signifier presupposes. So it all goes back to also the same theme that, came up, like the idea that you take the Old Man and the Sea, you ignore, the meaning of the book, and you use it to wipe the wounds of the animals. That's essentially.
Oh, it's super helpful. Thank you so much for sharing. I know a little bit about that, both in my work on language, but also in David Abrams speaks about that in his book, Becoming Animal, which is a little bit romantic with the lowercase r, not as much in the uppercase r. And I think another way that I could have split the sources in this paper, now that I'm thinking about it, would be learning through language versus learning not through language, because Jewish sources really split in an interesting way, and there's some where there's the kind of fissure in between. And part of what I try to avoid in thinking about this is any kind of over-romanticization of that kind of mimetic learning, which in our stage of, I don't know if I'll call it civilization, but certainly where we are today, language is so firmly entrenched in our cultural mind as well as in our physical mind. It strikes me that one of the ways that I might develop this thing further is thinking about a kind of post-humanistic vision of mimesis as opening up interspecies communication rather than interspecies language, let's say.
You're still within the language, the matrix of signification.
And in all of that, we are staying in human versus animals or nature. But I think we're not just to bring AI to everything, but yes, also to bring AI right now to everything. No, it's now the AI models that are working. They are not trying to analyze in the way we're analyzing. It's an attempt to generate, not just to generate, to understand. What they're doing now is an attempt to understand and then translate it to us. So not understand through our capacity of understanding, which is which is kind of crazy. So it's no longer.
But so that would be the dream of the fantasy, which I think is kind of like what they call a general AI, which is basically a marketing strategy for Sam Altman, who said, within 10 years, invest in us now, because within 10 years, we're going to have an AI that thinks for itself. Then what you're saying would apply.
No, they're working now on dolphin language.
Oh, you mean like the AI sort of mimics the dolphin?
They're using the AI. They're using. I don't understand anything in this. I just know people that's what they do.
I know people that know people.
And I was shocked to learn from that the computer does not work as translating from one language to another language like the dictionary did or like we do. That it translates to something else that then translates it to us. And I'm only saying that because we are in our conversation thinking all the time on these as the two kind of consciousness.
Thank you, everyone. This was wonderful. Thank you, Dibur. You're amazing.
Congratulations.